Okay, I have no prepared remarks. The time belongs entirely to you all, so you can ask any questions that you have about any of the material. Fewer than I expected, so if there's not very many, that's fine. I'll just sit here and wait for questions. Yep.
Can we just describe sort of cognitive evolution and cognitive psychology?
Sorry, hard to hear you. Say again?
Yeah, the difference between the cognitive revolution and cognitive psychology.
Good. So the cognitive revolution you can think of as just the beginning of cognitive psychology. So it's the period of time, maybe late 50s to 60s, where behaviorism fell out of favor and cognitive psychology became more dominant. Yep.
So in the questions, the test we're about to have on Tuesday,
Yep.
how are you going to mark our answers? Like, what should the structure of our answers be?
You mean the answer to the written?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the answer to the written, I won't be concerned so much with structure as there's going to be a set of things I'm looking for you to address. Even order doesn't really matter. I mean, there'll be a pretty clear order based on the way I ask the question, but what I'm going to be looking for is, do you address the things I have in mind? Yeah.
So why did we describe about humanistic psychology?
It's good. So humanistic psychology is a school of psychology that rejected a key assumption that many other paradigms had. That assumption is determinism. They didn't like the idea that humans are just machines governed by physical law. So even two very different perspectives, the Freudian perspective and the behaviorist perspective, they both endorse determinism. They don't accept free will, whereas the humanists had a more optimistic vision of human beings. We do have free will, we can self-actualize, etc. That's at least the part you have to know. Yep.
Do we have to know the names of the people we studied about?
Any name in the key terms is fair game.
Are we allowed to ask what's going to go next?
So you can ask about the written. So in class I talked about how, in fact, it's the same for 1200 for test 1. The written will be, it will involve me describing a positive correlation between two variables. You'll have to do two things. You'll have to explain why that doesn't mean changes in one variable cause changes in the other variable. So in other words, explain why correlation does not imply causation in the context of that example. So that's part 1.
Sorry, correlation does not
Imply causation. In other words, if two variables are correlated, you can't go from that to there's a causal relationship. And you have to describe how you would conduct an experiment to test whether changes in one variable cause changes in another variable. Yeah.
Do we have to give examples with our answers?
Yes, I think that would be a good thing to do. Yep.
For the test, what do you, besides the key terms, what do you recommend we study? Like, should we?
The key terms is the most important thing to study. So if you have those memorized, you'll be good. I would, so you can also review the lecture videos. That's good to do. Those are available on through Blackboard. Some people have asked, because maybe they didn't see the announcement, there's a link called something like lecture playlist in Blackboard. That's and this will be there as well. The PowerPoint notes, the study notes that are available, those won't cover everything. They're not exhaustive, but they'll hammer home some of the key ideas, so you can use that. And of course, you can use the book. But even with the book and the PowerPoint notes, let the key terms guide what you focus on.
they're on Blackboard.
Yeah, everything's on Blackboard. Yeah.
Thank you. So you know,
Of course, yeah. Hey, that's what this is for.
is it it's written and multiple choice, or is it?
Yeah, so the breakdown's in the syllabus for all the tests. You could look at that. So for all of them, it'll be 20 multiple choice questions per chapter. So in this case, 40 multiple choice and 1 written.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any past question papers that you used to study?
Like practice tests? No, so I don't provide practice tests. Here's one way to think about the different tests. Each one is a kind of practice test because none of them are especially high stakes, especially the first few. So the test is only 15%, and 3% of that, if I remember correctly, is the written, which you already know. So only 12% of your grade comes from the multiple choice for this first test. So you'll get a sense of how hard it is, and then if you did do well, then you can just keep studying as you did this time. Yep.
Can you just please explain the difference between type 1 error and type 2?
Good, so very important distinction. So the way I did it in class, common way of doing it, you distinguish between the state of the world. So this is whatever is true. Leaving aside what we believe, what's objectively true in the world? Is your hypothesis true or false? So there's the state of affairs in which your hypothesis is true and in which your hypothesis is false. Now, we are not omniscient, we don't know everything, so we can't know for sure if our hypothesis is true or false. So we have to collect data and come to a decision or conclusion about the hypothesis. We can, I forget what order I did it in, but we can conclude that it's false or that it's true. So in this case, obviously, we made no error, right? We concluded that it was true, and it in fact is true. Same here, we concluded the hypothesis is false, and it is false. So these are the 2 error points. One type of error is a type 1 error, which if you want to kind of keep in the back of your head, that means a false positive. So you concluded that there is an effect, that your hypothesis is right, but in fact your hypothesis is false. Type 2, also called a false negative, is where you conclude there's no effect, you conclude your hypothesis is false, but in fact the hypothesis was true. So the way that I remembered it in undergrad was type 2, just imagine 1 rotating into a minus for -1. If you think that's goofy, you can think of something else, but that's the way I remembered it. Yep.
Do you have all class 2 subjects?
You do. So this takes care of a lot of different things. Sometimes students need accommodations, so this kind of takes care of that. In theory, it's designed to take only 80 minutes, so an hour and 20 minutes. That's how long my students at the U of A had, and it's roughly the same test. But yeah, so there is a very small chance you'll need all that time, but yeah, you have the whole time. Yep.
Can we give the answers in our own words, or should we stick to what's written in the notes or the textbook?
You mean for the written, I guess, I assume you're asking about. Yeah, no, I'd be in favor of you putting it in your own words. I guess one little hint. In the question, I will mention some terms I'd like included, so obviously refer to those. But in general, yeah, I would like it if you put it in your own words. I mean, if you quote me exactly, that's fine too, but by my lights, it shows more understanding if you put it in your own words. Yep. And if I'm passing time on the computer and I don't see you, you can just make a noise, but yeah.
Can we just review about the null hypothesis and the p-value? What is the relationship?
Good, so you don't need to know the term null hypothesis, but you should know the term p-value. So this is a difficult concept. So the example I used in class, which is a nice one to think about, suppose you're looking for a sex difference, so difference between males and females. So this is the population. We'll suppose that we're just talking about Canadian males and females, so that's our population, everyone we're interested in. So for whatever it's worth, the null hypothesis is the hypothesis that you want to reject. In most contexts, what that will mean is it's the hypothesis that there's no effect or no difference. Or if it's a correlational study, the null hypothesis would be the correlation is 0. So in this case, it would be there's no difference between males and females. So I think I used video games in class. You know, I don't know, let's pick something more interesting, maybe like charitable giving. Do males or females give more to charity? So the null hypothesis would be there's no difference. So we can't ask everyone, that's too hard. So you get a sample of males and females, 500 females, 500 males. So let's say it's what percent of your income do you give to charity? Let's say it's 2.3 in females and 2.2 in males. The p-value is about how likely it is that you would get this result if the null hypothesis is true. So it could be that in the population, there's no difference between males and females in charitable giving. And you just happen to, in this case, sample more charitable women, right? Now, in this case, you should have the intuition that the p-value is not going to be very small. It's not that, this is not a very big difference. It's not that surprising that you would get a difference like this if there's no difference in the population. If it was something like this, if women on average give 13.1% to charity in the sample, now the p-value will be very small. It's very unlikely that you would get that kind of difference if there's no difference in the population. So that's what the p-value is. So the p-value ranges from 0 to 1. It's never actually 0. It's 1 if the if it was like 2.2 and 2.2, the p-value would be 1. So we want the p-value to be smaller, and the magic number is 0.05. We set like a cutoff, and we say we want the p-value to be less than this cutoff. And then we deem it statistically significant.
So if it's the p-value is less than 0.5, then it's likely accepted?
Yeah, we will provisionally accept this as a real difference, and less than 0.05. I once also said 0.5 in front of the class, so that wasn't good. But what this means is less than 5% likely. Yep.
For range, I remember that you explained it 2 ways, right?
No, the range is simple. The range I only explained once. The standard deviation is the one I explained twice.
Oh,
Yeah.
can you explain both?
I'll do both. Yeah. So these are they're related in that they are both measures of variability. So measures of how spread out the scores are. Range is the simpler one. It's actually pretty rarely used, but because it doesn't give you that much information. But it's the largest score minus the smallest score. I think the example I gave in class was, if let's say it's the range of grades in a course. If the highest guy or gal gets 100 and the lowest guy or gal gets 1, then the range is 99, right? Pretty intuitive. The standard deviation, the definition you need to know for the test that's good enough. I mentioned it's not quite right. You wouldn't get through a statistics class with this, but it's a good first approximation. It's how far away, on average, are scores from the mean. So some scores are very far, some are close. Okay, but how far away on average are they? Yep.
Will we have to calculate the standard deviation?
Definitely not, no. Yeah. So the calculation example I used in class, that's just for the nerds. So for the nerds who want to know how to calculate it, that's how. But I think I mentioned in class, you can repress that if that traumatized you.
I thought we had to know how to do it.
No, definitely not. No. In 2300, you'll learn how to do it and have to know, but not now. Yeah.
Can we please review the natural selection?
Say again.
Natural selection.
Natural what?
Selection is from the first chapter.
Natural selection.
Oh, selection. Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course. So I'll give the one sentence definition, and then I'll give an example. So natural selection is the process by which genes that produce traits that are more suited to the environment increase in frequency over time. Or I could just say for short, genetic traits that are suited to the environment increase in frequency over time. So, I think I used the bear example in class, but let's use another one. Let's say it's giraffes, right? So there's an environment with more tall trees with leaves that are high up, and there's various genes for length of neck, some short, some medium, some long. If the environment has more tall trees with leaves high up, the animals that have the long neck genes will have more kids. They'll live longer, copulate more, have more babies. And as time passes, eventually all of the giraffes in that area will have long necks. Yep.
In class, you said we had to know the scatter plots and how to identify whether it's positive or negative. Could you just quickly go over that?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
So you have to know two things. You have to know the direction of the correlation, so is it positive or negative, and the strength of the correlation. So direction is just, which way is the line pointing, right? So if it's pointing if it's like this, it's negative. If it's like this, it's positive. The conceptual definition would be a positive correlation means as one variable increases, the other increases too. So they increase together. A negative one means as one goes up, the other goes down. So I think the way the book says it is more is less. Strength has to do with how tightly clustered around that line are the participants, the data points. So if it's like this would be a very strong correlation. This might be positive 0.9 and negative 0.9. So these are roughly equally strong. And strong means further away from 0. So a correlation that's weaker might look like this. So now there's still a trend upwards, but you have a decreased ability to predict what someone's score is on this variable based on this other variable. There's more, because there's more spread. So I'm just pulling this number out of the air, but maybe 0.5, I don't know, but less. And then 0, flat line, dots all over the place. There's no association between the two variables.
And you said for the test you're going to put an example?
I think so. So I have two tests with Chapter 2, because Chapter 2 is the one chapter that's covered in both 11 and 1200, but you certainly should be ready to do that.
To say if it's positive or negative?
Yeah.
Okay.
And which one is stronger.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
On the test, we have to know the time frames for when things happen in history.
Yes, you should have I'm not going to ask specific dates, 1879 was when Wundt started his lab. That's too mean. But here's what I'll say. You should have a sense of the order of events, because there's actually kind of a sequence, right? So, for example, the behaviorists were a reaction against Freud, Wundt, and James. And then the cognitive revolution is a reaction against the behaviorist. So that kind of general trend is important. Yep.
Well, what exactly is Gestalt psychology?
Good. So Gestalt psychology was kind of I guess you could say, a backwater against behaviorism. A lot of the research was done at the same time, but unlike the behaviorists, the Gestalt people did talk about the mind, how the mind works, what the mind does. Their main interest was perception, so especially visual perception, and their argument was that when it comes to visual perception, the whole, or the Gestalt, as they would say, is more than the sum of its parts. So here are, so there's two parts here, this bottom shape and this shape. But when you look at this, you perceive a triangle. You sort of put the things together into a whole or a category. That's a very simple example. And they studied the ways in which we visually identify patterns like that, and sometimes impose patterns on segments of visual perception. So that's the main thing they worked on.
Well, then, when you say it's the main thing, did they do other stuff too?
Yeah, so they also tried to work this out as a way of doing therapy, which I always thought was kind of strange, but there is such a thing as Gestalt therapy. We talk about that in 1200. Maybe they did other stuff. Those are the two things I know. But for in the context of chapter 1, all you have to know is basically what they thought about visual perception. Yeah, you're free to go anytime. Yeah, it's no obligation to stay.
And you said this was going to be posted.
Yep, it'll be posted.
Thank you so much.
Yep, no worries.
Will we
Yep.
have to draw a scatter graph?
Have to what?
Will we have to draw a scatter graph?
No.
I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but I say, what is the difference between
Empiricism.
about the origin of idea and then about justification of ideas?
Good. So I introduced this distinction because the book uses empiricism in two different senses. It uses it in one sense in chapter 1 and says that it's bad, basically, and another sense in chapter 2 and says that it's good. So I thought I'd clarify what the difference is. So empiricism in the sense of origin, like where our ideas or beliefs, etc., come from, is contrasted with nativism. So here, empiricism is essentially an answer to the nurture-nature debate. Or I guess it's usually said nature-nurture debate. So where do our beliefs, ideas, tendencies come from? Empiricists, in this sense of the term, say that they all come from experience, meaning none of them are innate. We are, to use John Locke, so John Locke is an empiricist, actually in both senses. John Locke says that we are a blank slate. We are born as a blank sheet of paper, and the environment writes on us. So all of our ideas come from experience. Nativism says that at least some of our ideas are innate. I don't think anyone says all are, that would be kind of silly, but at least some of our ideas are innate. In the context of this debate, most psychologists today are nativists. They think that at least some of our tendencies, beliefs, etc., are built in, or at least a bias towards them is built in by the genes. The other sense of empiricism, which is one that most psychologists think is good, is empiricism about the justification of our ideas. Justification is about providing support for an idea. So if an idea is justified, that means there's good reason to believe it. In this sense, empiricism is contrasted with rationalism. Rationalism is the view that there are at least some things we can know just by thinking about them, just by using rational thought. I don't have to go look at the world or measure or do observations. I can just close my eyes and think about it. Whereas empiricists say, no, if you want to know whether something is true, you have to do observation. You have to look at the world.
we also have the experiments?
Sorry?
We also have the experiments for justification?
So empiricists, experiments are just one type of observation. You could also do observation that's not scientific. I mean, you know, if I want to know what's inside this drawer, okay, I'm curious, okay, I go over, okay, there's like a cord and stuff. But that's observation. It's not really an experiment, I'm just, you know, looking. So this is kind of a silly example, but yeah, an empiricist would say, I can't just think about what's in the drawer, I have to look at it.
So there's like a question on empiricism on the test. Are you gonna like tell us which version you mean, or do we have to figure it out based on context?
I'll tell you what to mean based on context if it matters. I guess what I would say is, on the test and in general, if you're reading about this, assume it's the latter if no other information is given. It's the more commonly used sense. One reason for so both of them have to do with experience or observation. That's the connection between the two. The distinction is, this says all of our ideas come from that, and this one says, maybe, maybe not, but the point is we have to use observation to know whether those ideas are right. Yep.
So I'm confused about the correlations.
Mhm.
So can you please like explain like how do we know, like you know how you mentioned how like the stronger and the weaknesses of the
Yep.
correlation and everything?
Yeah, for sure. I can talk about that. So someone asked before you came, but that's okay. That's your time. So the short version is to know about direction, just look at the way that the trend is going. So if the trend looks like this, it's positive. If it looks like this, it's negative. So that's about which side of zero it will be on. As far as strength, the short version is, the more tightly clustered around the line, the further away it is from zero. So this would be like maybe 0.9, right? Because they're pretty tightly clustered around the line. If it looked more like this, you know, it might be 0.5, for example. So there's more spread and randomness. And a consequence of this is, if you know someone's score on this variable, you have a decreased ability to predict what their score will be on this variable, if it's a weaker relationship. And the same holds for negative ones, so like, you know, this might be, you know, minus 0.5. And if they're all exactly on the line, so this is the best case scenario that you'll never see, that would be minus 1. Does that make sense, or do you have a follow-up?
I'm like confused about the clustering. So if it's more clustered around the line, that means it would be closer to zero?
No, further from zero.
Further from zero? Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, more tightly clustered around the line means a stronger relationship. I mean, here's one example that might help. I'll make this practical. So I mentioned in one of the classes, I forget which one, but so let's say you're using a correlation to predict who's going to commit crimes again. This is commonly used. So the example I gave was, there's a psychopathy measure called the PCLR. This is a measure of how psychopathic someone is. And let's say this is, you know, how many crimes they commit after being let out of prison. And so let's say in one case, the correlation looks like this. So this is crimes. And let's say in this case, the correlation looks like this. Actually, I'll make it even more extreme. Let's say in one case there's no or almost no relationship. You know, maybe 0.2. You know, very slight trend, but pretty random. know that someone has a low PCLR score, so that they're low on psychopathy, in which case do you feel more confident they're not going to commit crimes? Or put another way, in which case are you more likely to say they can babysit my kids? And the answer is this one, right? Because, okay, I know they're low on PCLR, I know they're probably not going to commit crimes. Here, if I know they have a low PCLR score, I really don't know very much about their likelihood of committing crimes. Yeah.
Can we please review how the internal validity and the external works?
Internal and external validity? Yeah, for sure. So, I'll start with, let me see if I have a better font. So, internal validity is about within your study. So hence within your study, hence internal I should say, within your study, how confident can you be that changes in the independent variable caused changes in the dependent variable? So let's say we're doing that visualization experiment that we did in class. So let's say we do it as a between subjects experiment. So we randomly assign people to two conditions. One does visualizing of word pairs in their head, and one does auditory, like saying the word pairs. So that's the independent variable, which memorization strategy they use. The dependent variable is how many words they memorize. That's the thing we measure at the end. So internal validity is about how confident I can be that this caused a change in this. So, for example, if, as is the case, people in the visualization condition remember more word pairs, how confident can we be that it was because of the visualization strategy that they did better? Does that make sense?
So we could measure how much confident we are based on those dependent.
So don't worry about quantifying it. So actually, I think it was you asked about, can we connect this to the p-value? You could draw a connection there, but don't worry about it as a quantifiable thing. Just think of it in terms of a judgment, like how sure are we that this caused this? And the thing in particular to think about, and this isn't really a numerical thing, is just, are there confounding variables? That's the main threat to internal validity. So, whereas I said in class, a confounding variable is anything that's different between the two conditions other than the independent variable. At least in the context of an experiment, that's what a confounding variable is. Yep.
When you say that's the main threat, does that mean there are others?
I want to say, now this is going online, so if a statistician corrects me, I'll take this down, but I think almost by definition this is the threat to internal validity. Certainly it's the only one you need to think about for the test. So I think the example I gave in class was, if there's two conditions, one with teaching method A and one with teaching method B, if one group is from Edmonton and one is from Vancouver, location would be a confounding variable, right? Because, so so there's the Edmonton kids and the Vancouver kids, and I give, so the independent variable is teaching method A versus teaching method B. So if the Edmonton kids do better, I don't know if it's because of the teaching method or because of what city they're from. So I don't have high internal validity. I can't have high confidence that it's my independent variable that made the difference. Oh, and sorry, you asked about external validity too. So any questions before I erase this? So external validity is about going beyond your study. So internal validity is about, forget about the world outside the lab. Just within my lab, how confident can I be that this caused a change in this? External validity is about how confident I can be that the pattern I found in the lab with my sample will generalize to the real world. And there's 2 threats. Anyone want bonus marks if they remember what they are? No bonus marks. But can anyone remember what they are?
Unrepresentative sample and
Yep.
unrealistic lab situation.
Yeah, exactly. So unrepresentative sample, so if the sample deviates from the population in terms of demographics like age, gender, etc., that's going to be a problem for external validity. And if what goes on in the lab is very contrived, unrealistic, not representative of what happens in the real world, again, you'll have less confidence that it will generalize.
Sorry, was that a bonus question or?
No, I just made a joke saying, hey, who wants bonus marks if they remember? But no, I'm not actually going to give it. Yep.
Can we be specific with our answers? Like, for example, if there's a question to define the term falsifiable and I answer with something that can be proven wrong, would that give me the
Well, so the only question where you can even do that is the one written. So everything else is multiple choice, so that issue doesn't even arise.
Can we still ask what the written question's gonna be on the exam?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so is it gonna be basically we have to do a description of a positive correlation?
No, so someone else asked this. I may have spoken quickly. So, no, so I'll describe a positive correlation. I'll say, suppose that it's discovered that these 2 things are positively correlated. You'll have to do 2 things. You'll have to explain why that doesn't mean that the first one causes the second one. So in other words, why correlation does not imply causation. And you'll have to describe how you would set up an experiment to test whether A causes B.
So we have to come up with an experiment?
Yeah, you'll have to describe it. I mean, it'll be pretty cookie cutter. Like I can go through some of it now, but you'll go through the same steps I described in class when talking about it.
So can I just say what you said right now?
Yeah, right, yeah.
So we have to describe positive correlation. I mean, you're going to give us positive
Yeah.
correlation. We have to explain why the correlation doesn't imply causation.
Yeah.
And we have to describe how we have to come up with an experiment to determine A causes B.
Yeah, exactly. So correlation doesn't tell us if A causes B, but if we want to know, how would we find out whether A causes B?
So is there a good way like to explain the hindsight bias? So like we learned in class, it's like something we already know. So like how could, as a written question, how could we paraphrase it?
Yeah, so one thing hindsight bias is sometimes called is the I knew it all along thing. So I guess it's easy to tell yourself that a certain fact is obvious once you already know it. If you don't know what the right answer is, it's much harder to predict in advance. But once you already know, it's like, oh yeah, I already knew that. That's obvious. That's uninteresting.
What exactly is the observer bias?
So it's given a different name in some textbooks, but in this textbook, they use the term observer bias to refer to the fact that the biases or expectations of the experimenter can affect how the subjects behave. Specifically, if I know who's in which condition in an experiment, I may unwittingly influence their behavior by treating them differently, depending on which condition they're in.
Is this the same thing or different thing from the Hawthorne effect?
Hawthorne effect I don't think is in this chapter, but the Hawthorne effect is more general. It's just that people behave differently when they're being observed. So it's closer to what the book calls demand characteristics. But the Hawthorne effect is more general. It's just people behave differently when they know they're being observed.
And then we say in order to avoid this, we use double blind.
Yeah. Yep.
Can we review about the ego and super ego difference?
Yeah, for sure. So this is Freud's way of carving up the human mind. Well, he has different ways of doing it, but this is one way of carving it up. So the id is, it comes from the German word it. So this is like the kind of raw, animalistic part of the human mind. So desire for food, for sex, for things like that. That's the id. So the id is very selfish, just me, me, me. The ego emerges later, maybe in mid-childhood, and it initially emerges to kind of control the id. It's like, hey, you gotta be more realistic and strategic, when trying to get what you want. And then the superego is the conscience, so your sense of what's right and wrong. So as a result, the id and the superego are often, opposed to each other.
So all those three happen unconsciously, right?
If I remember, so don't worry about that. For whatever it's worth, I think the id is entirely unconscious. These two are partly conscious, partly unconscious, but that's more advanced. You don't have to know that.
I'm confused. I'm sort of still confused with the correlation. So looking at your slides, you're showing, like, for example, correlation around 0.2, 0.8. So I'm just confused about the lining. So for a correlation of 0, it's like straight like this. And then 0.2 is like this, but then 0.8 goes all the way like...
Good. So this is a common question that students ask. There's not a direct relationship between the slope and the strength of the correlation. There is a connection in that if the correlation is 0, the slope will be flat. But you can have a correlation of 1 with a not that high slope. So for example, this would be a correlation of 1, right? Even though it has a flat slope. So the thing to remember is a stronger correlation will have the dots more tightly clustered around the line. That's what matters more. But it is true that yes, if it's 0, the slope will of necessity be flat.
So there's no specific pattern we're supposed to look for?
What do you mean by pattern? Well, there is a pattern, but what?
Like the lines, because I was just worried, like...
So no, yeah, the slope isn't the main thing.
Slope, okay.
Yeah.
Can we do replication crisis and the pre-registration?
Good. So the replication crisis is a recent thing in psychology. People try to replicate large numbers of random studies from good psychology journals. So just look at their methods section, do exactly what they do, and see if you find the same pattern. And depending on your cutoff, something like half of studies don't replicate, so that's bad. This was in the early 2010s. There were a number of reforms pushed for to try to make our results more replicable. And in my opinion, one of the most important ones is pre-registration. Pre-registration means before you do your study, you say in advance exactly what you're going to do. So that you're not just playing with the data after and trying out different analyses. Or at least if you do play with the data, you have to admit that's what you did. And then add the caveat that this isn't what I originally predicted, so someone else should try to replicate this.
Do we have to memorize the weird problem acting?
No, you don't have to memorize that. As long as you know what it refers to, that's fine.
Can we just roughly explain what it's about?
Yeah, well, what it stands for whatever it's worth, is Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. So basically it refers to places like Canada, the United States, and Western Europe, and a few other places. And the point that Joe Heinrich made with that is that most studies, by a pretty big margin, in psychology are done with weird samples. So samples of people from those countries. But now look, if we were honest and just said, hey, we're just studying weird people, that's fine. But what we often say is we're studying the human mind, human thinking. And it's like, well, you're not really studying all of humanity. You're studying a small subsection.
Can you explain the central tendency, like the mean, the mean?
Good. So the mean is the same as the average. So add up the scores, divide it by the number of scores. The median is the middle score. So order the scores from smallest to biggest, and then pick the score in the middle. And then the mode is the most commonly occurring score.
Okay, and what does outliers mean? Because you mentioned.
Yeah, so good question. So that connects to the concept of the mean. So an outlier is just an extreme score, or a set of extreme scores. So scores that are way above or way below everyone else. So I think the extreme example I gave was, if there's 4 people in a village who have $0 and one guy in the village who has $1 million, he's an outlier, right? He's way above everyone else. And the crucial point in connection to central tendency is that the mean is very sensitive to extreme values or outliers. Yeah.
Can there be questions like describe Wooden's role in the development of psychology?
Describe what?
Describe Wooden's
Wundt?
yeah.
Yes, so like I said, the names are fair game. So the kind of key ideas of each of the names and the key terms, that's fair game.
Just a question for, if we want to show the independent and dependent on the graph, which one becomes on the lower side?
You mean in a correlation?
Yes.
So in this class, I only use the terms independent and dependent variable in the context of an experiment. But the answer is, if you're doing a scatter plot, so don't worry about this for the test, but what researchers will do as a matter of convention is put the variable on the bottom if that's the one they think is causing the other one. So I actually, in one of the classes with the video, I should have put sports here. That would have been in keeping with that convention. So, but yeah, as a general rule, the one that you think of as the independent variable is the one you put on the bottom. But don't worry about that for the test. Yep.
Can you explain the p-value?
Yeah, good. So the example I used, actually there's another one before you came in, but happy to explain again. So there's the population, males and females in this case, and let's say your hypothesis is that there's a sex difference. So you can't study everyone in the population, that's too hard, so you get a sample. So you get 700 females, 700 males, and the example I used before you came was you're looking at charitable giving. So what percentage of income do males and females give to charity? So let's say that you find that females give 2.7 and males give 2.6 in your sample. So the key thing is, it's possible that in the population there's zero difference. And that you just happen to get a few more women who like giving to charity, so the average is higher. And in this case, it's not that unlikely. Right? You can imagine, it's very easy to imagine that in the population there's zero difference, and you just happen to get more women that like giving to charity. So that would be an example of a p-value that's not that low. So I'll give a definition first. So the p-value is the probability of getting your result if there's no difference in the population. So you want lower p-values. So there's no way it would be this big, but if it was 15.6 in the for females in your sample, you would have a very small p-value, right? It's very unlikely that you would get a difference that big if there's no difference in the population. So here the p-value might be 0.0001 or something. It'd be very small. And so you want it to be small, and the magic cutoff that we set as a matter of convention is 0.05. We want that p-value to be less than 0.05. Once it is, we use the phrase statistically significant. That all that means is it's less than the cutoff we set.
So if it's more higher, then the p-value would be lower?
So which is higher? Like the
females, like how you choose 15.6.
So yeah, if the difference is bigger,
Yeah.
there's actually other things that will make the p-value lower too, but this is the easiest one to understand. So just as an aside, if sample size is bigger, the p-value goes down too, if there's still a difference. And if the variability in each group is smaller, that also makes the p-value smaller, but I'll stick with this just to be clear. So, yeah, so if the difference between the two groups is bigger, then yes, the p-value, that will make the p-value smaller, because it makes it less likely that you'd get that difference if there's no difference in the population. Yeah?
Another question, but like, another thing that makes the p-value smaller is if your sample size is bigger.
So there's three main things that make the p-value smaller. If the difference between the two groups is bigger, if we're talking about group differences, I'll leave correlations aside. And if the variability in each group is smaller, and if the sample size is bigger. So in the case of sample size, let's say we found a difference like this, but there's 6 people in each group. Well, it's actually not that unlikely we get a difference this big, right? You just need one person in that group who gives a lot. All of a sudden, the average is a lot higher. If it's 1 million people in each group and we got a difference this big, that's pretty unlikely that we'd get a difference like that. So this is more advanced, but since you asked, in the case of variability, let's pick a more modest difference. Let's say it's 8 and 5% of income. Let's imagine 2 scenarios. In one scenario, the 2 distributions look like this. So there's more variability. In another case, let's say it looks like this. Intuitively, it looks more unlikely we'd get something like this if there's no difference. Here, it's like, well, even though even if the mean difference is the same. Now, if that gives you a headache, that's more advanced. So for the test, you can just think about, in fact, I don't think you even have to really worry about this, but the example that's easier to understand is if the difference between the two is bigger.
What's the difference between a hypothesis and a theory?
Good. So a theory I guess, has more going on. The way I put it in class is as kind of a nice first approximation. You can think of a theory as a network of well-supported hypotheses. That's one way to think about it. So a theory is a set of statements that are logically connected to each other and that explain a large amount of data. So if you think of Newton's theory, right, Newtonian gravitational theory, there's like Newton's laws, right? There's multiple ones that are connected and they explain a large body of data. A hypothesis might be, if I drop this ball, it will fall at this rate. That's a specific testable statement that, in that case, follows from Newtonian theory. Yep.
What is the difference between subject experiment and within subject experiment?
Good. So here's the way to think about and connect it to the word. So in a between subjects experiment, you get a group and you randomly assign them to 2 or more groups. I'll stick with 2 just to be simple. And what you're looking for is a difference between those 2 groups. So if one group gets the drug, the other group gets the placebo, and maybe the dependent variable is size of the tumor. You're looking at whether the drug is a good cancer treatment. Well, at the end, you're going to look for a difference between these 2 groups in tumor size, right? Now, drugs wouldn't work for within subjects, but in within subjects, there's just one group, and they do both levels of the independent variable. So in class, when we did that memorization game, and we did like auditory and then visual, that's within subjects. There's only one group, and everyone's doing both things.
So what about the classical conditioning, like who invented John or the Eva? Because like both of them are written the same.
Good. So classical conditioning was discovered by Ivan Pavlov. He discovered it in the context of dogs. Watson applied the principles of classical conditioning to humans and went further and said, basically, this is all that's going on. That humans are purely a product of these kinds of conditioning processes. So Pavlov didn't make big generalizations like that. Pavlov was just looking at animal reactions. Yep.
Can you go over replication prices?
Yeah, so just, you could put it in one sentence, just the fact that it was discovered in the early 2010s that a large chunk of psychology results are not replicable. Meaning, if it's written in the journal that such and such happens, and some guy tries to do it, you don't get the same result.
Who exactly is Noam Chomsky and what did he do?
Oh, actually, I'm not sure I mentioned him. So he is probably the most important person as far as starting the cognitive revolution. There's a number of other people around the same time. In 1200, we talk more about him, but B.F. Skinner tried to offer an explanation of language acquisition, so how we learn language, purely in terms of reward and punishment. Chomsky argued that couldn't be right, and that some of language has to be built in at the beginning. He argued that human beings have an innate proclivity towards learning language, and that it's not just a matter of conditioning. And this is one of the things that teed off the cognitive revolution. He's still alive, actually. He's in his 90s, and I doubt he still does this, but as of a few years ago, he was still responding to every email that he got. He was famous for this, even though he was at one point the single most cited living person. He spent hours every day responding to every email that he got. Now, he had a stroke a year or two ago, so I doubt he still does that. I tried it a handful of times, and he wrote answers that only he could have written. So he's an interesting dude.
So So what is cognitive psychology?
Cognitive psychology is a paradigm within psychology that relies heavily on the analogy with computers. It thinks of or cognitive psychologists think of the human brain as a kind of information processor. So it receives inputs from the environment, processes it in a particular way, and produces particular outputs. As a result, they tend to look at types of thinking that are most analogous with how computers work. So memory is a big topic in cognitive psychology, language processing, beliefs, things like that. So they would tend to not study something like emotion that's not quite fair, but it's not top of the research agenda. Let's put it that way.
I just want to ask about the Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
Was he basically against behaviorism?
Yes, was and is. You can find videos on YouTube of him ranting about behaviorism. Yeah.
Can you do an example on dependent-independent variable?
Yeah, for sure. So, let's say I'll do something really simple. I want to see if praise improves performance on tests. So I take this group and I randomly assign you all to two conditions. In the control condition, I just say hello. So just say some meaningless thing. The other half I say, you're gonna do amazing. You're such a good student, you'll crush this test. And then, so that would be the independent variable. The independent variable is the thing that I manipulate or control. So I give it to one, or give one level of it to one group and don't give it to the other group. And then the dependent variable is the variable I measure. So let's say it's your score on test 1. Score on test 1 would be the dependent variable. If people in the praise condition do better than those in the no praise condition, I would infer that praise causes better performance on the test. So the way to remember it is, if your hypothesis is right, the dependent variable depends on the independent variable.
What if it's wrong?
If it's wrong, then, well, you still call it the dependent and independent variable. I'm just saying that as a way to remember it, that it's about what would happen if your hypothesis is right. So in this case, score on the test depends on level of praise. Yep.
Let's explain about the twin studies.
Good, yeah. So there are two different kinds of twin studies. One I would worry less about, but the kind of twin study that's easiest to understand is you look at identical twins who are raised in separate families. So identical twins share 100% of their DNA. So these are really nice, almost natural experiments where the twins share none of their home environment, right? They grow up in different families, but they share all of their genes. And the way to think about it is, if genes play no role in how people turn out, then the twins should not be similar for a given trait. So what you can do is measure how correlated, what's the correlation between twins in different behaviors. And what you find is that for basically every psychological trait you can measure, they are substantially similar. For no trait are they 100% similar, but a big chunk of the variance in different kinds of behaviors and traits is explainable by genes. That's one kind. The other kind, which is a bit harder to understand, is you look at twins raised in the same family, so forget about adoption, and you look at identical twins compared to fraternal twins. So identical twins share twice as many genes, right? Identical twins share 100% of genes, non-identical twins share half of their genes, just like siblings do. If genes make no difference to a trait, then identical twins should not be more similar than the non-identical twins. But what you find is, again, for basically every trait you can measure, the identical twins are substantially more similar than the fraternal twins. Yeah.
Can you explain the Gestalt psychology?
Yeah, so the short version is they looked at visual perception. I mean, perception and other things too, but the area they really are famous for is their work in visual perception. And the example I showed earlier was, if you look at, this, so strictly speaking, this is 3 shapes, but all of us helplessly perceive this as a triangle. What we're doing is looking for patterns, trying to organize things together into coherent wholes. The way they sometimes summarize this is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when you put these things together, it's more than the individual parts. We perceive it as something more. So that was how they thought the mind works. It tries to put things together into patterns.
So basically this way the whole is greater than the sum.
The whole is greater than the sum. Yeah, that's the way they said it.
I just have a question. How long will be given?
The whole class time, which will be way more than you need.